We've got Matt and Angus here to talk about cyber ranges and how they can be deployed in your businesses, practicing what we're doing here. It's going to be a fascinating conversation. They're going to take some questions at the end, so think about as you go along anything you want to ask, and I'll bring a mic to you.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. Well, we'll get started here. I do have Cliff. Hi, I'm Angus. I'm a hacker. A security researcher. Sorry. And Packetmaster, and also the creator of Packetwars, the world's first cyber sport, and all-around swell guy. If you need to get a hold of me, you can do it on Twitch or go to packetwars.com. So in the beginning, I've been around for a bit. Child of the Cold War. Anybody remember a movie called War Games? Okay, so that was my kind of first exposure to cyber war or anything involving computers. And of course, I wanted to hack a Gibson and with a C64 too. Space War, anybody remember Space War? Probably the first computer game. MIT, played on some real old equipment, and they had a long-running feud with Stanford. So you want to know some history that's real interesting. The coolest thing about the hacks in that was they were actually hacking the platform. So they found ways to actually corrupt, instead of just playing the game straight, they would corrupt the memory that would keep for their other team's turns, so they never got a turn. Or they would just crash memory to wipe them out off the face. So I'm like, that is really cool. And that's kind of what's influenced me throughout my life. I'm not a bug hunter. I like architecture flaws because they can't be patched easily. And of course, Dungeons and Dragons scenarios, and that heavily influenced the direction that Packetwars has taken. And that's why I'm a packet master. Like many cases, there weren't a lot of games to play. So I had to go out there and run the games in hopes that people would create games. And now I'm kind of stuck running games. So there you go. In the late 90s, the hacking scene was pretty interesting. There were a lot of regional small conferences you probably never heard of. And in fact, I was with a company early on called Secure IT, maybe next to Nexus. I'm mispronouncing their name. They don't exist as an entity anymore. But we were the first firewall companies, training companies. I used to run around with a complete checkpoint firewall rig, going and doing training in hotel rooms. And some of my associates did too. And we had dedicated IP addresses that we would use on dual dial-ups. And so essentially, we'd be setting the rooms up and all this stuff. So we were fighting each other as we were setting up the game. So all very interesting live fire exercises before we even knew that was a thing. It was really us just messing with each other. Or at conferences, and the cool thing at conferences, we would play capture the flag games, little challenges and things like that. And we'd actually run Cat 5 to everybody's hotel room. And there's some really interesting stories. A lot of this stuff is documented for posterity. In some places, it's really hard to find because, the search engines suppress it. But if you want to really get into this, hit me up and I'll send you some of the Wayback Machine links. Or maybe even if you buy me an adult beverage, I'll regale you with some stories. And there were capture the flag games out there. They weren't as sophisticated as what we have today, but they did exist. The downside to that was burnout. If you especially look at DEF CON, you practice all year to play for 3 days and you don't get to hang out with anybody, right? Or you go run a game like that. It is a lot of work and it's a lot of volunteerism. Maybe people had aspirations of business models, but it was really volunteer passion stuff. And people got burnt out. Of course, the frequency, as I mentioned, once a year, doesn't really let you become a cyber athlete. If you can only do it once a year. And there weren't ranges to go play on. And of course, you're dealing with hackers. So the majority of the hackers that played our early games, they didn't care about winning the game. They really just wanted to mess around with us. And they always would attack the game. And there's some really good observations and learnings that we got with people. Some serious security flaws that we identified vis-a-vis people trying to screw with us. But again, that's distracting if your objective is to have a fair game, be inclusive, and bring people in to have fun. Just because you hacked the game, you probably ruined the event for everybody. That's not cool. All hail Caesar. So I don't know if you ever heard of Caesar and the ghetto hackers. These are OGs. They won the DEF CON Capture the Flags 3 years in a row, and they did the right thing, mic drop, and never played again. Although they did run the most interesting game that I ever saw in 2002, and that is where they basically had all the teams represent as corporations. So the scoreboard was actually a ticker tape of their performance on the stock market, and their injects was this cool geisha girl cyber punk person that would come on, and whenever the score changed, she would come on and talk trash about the company. You know, you might want to short that stock. And it hit me like a lightning bolt. This is a spectator-friendly event. This could be a sport. So Caesar, and he was very gracious. All the ghetto hackers were. They helped us along in my crew, HackSec, and that's kind of why I'm here today. If it wasn't for them, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it or learned. So we stand on the shoulders of giants, they say. So hacking as a sport, Packetwars. Probably in 2004, we officially came out, but we were doing things before that. But we said, hey, we really need to do this. It is a sport. You can't hack sports, I mean, unless you're playing FIFA football. That's another conversation. We wanted to be spectator friendly, sponsor driven. So originally when we started doing this, my pitch was Formula One racing meets big time wrestling. And so we did develop some characters. We used to give points out for flair. That was fun. But we also wanted to use it to model, assess, and simulate. So some of the games, and most of the games that you'll see are like real world wicked problems that I'm testing to see if in fact it's a problem and looking for innovative ways to solve that problem. Because it's not enough just to point out the emperor has no clothes. You got to make them something to wear, right? So Sensei, why do we train? We're an intimate crowd here. Any idea? To win, of course. And the games that we play. Again, I have fun. I call it serious fun, PHUN, or edutainment, the combination. Because when you're having fun, you don't even realize that you're learning stuff, that subliminal stuff. This one, Pwn the Home, big brother. You're basically being held captive in your own smart house. So you have to figure out how to get out. Now that did not have the physical component. We had some, likes it was emulated, but this physical escape room over here, the escape bus, that's really, really cool stuff. And I like it when those domains come together. So the cyber and physical, but there's a lot of domains colliding. So when worlds collide, there's opportunity for fail. This one, Pwn the Drone, this was a cool one. We did this in a beer hall in Heidelberg. Essentially, you've got a drone, hack the drone, and you got to fly it to your base. Okay, and there was a lot of beer in that beer hall, so that I'm not sure you can get a license to do that in places, but this was before you even had to have licenses to do that. And of course, hackers don't ask permission. Gridlock, this was one that we did. These were theoretical use cases that at some point would be practical if adversaries decided to do this. So this one you'll notice is over 10 years old that we came up with Gridlock. The scenario here was an compromised electronic vehicle charging station infects a vehicle, and then the vehicle becomes the source for the lateral spread that is spread through the car-to-car communication systems that we will have to put in place soon. So watch this space because this stuff will happen. Trust me. And the last one we did, which we called You're Grounded, its scenario was around, this was in Heidelberg at Troopers, evil billionaire Leon Scum, notorious media whore, decides to fire all of his human employees and replace them with automated systems. And he got nervous that his upcoming launch for SpaceX mega rocket wasn't going to happen. And we had to call in a team of expert hackers to retrieve the launch codes. Very interesting. So much cool stuff in that one. Poisoned software pipelines, cyber physical convergence. And of course, we love taking stories and satiring billionaires. Been doing it for a long time. And, the games we play, you guys are getting exposed to some of them. We do a lot of red team. Blue team's where there's a deficiency. So the more defensive stuff you games, we're seeing more of them, and that's super important. It's not as cool to defend, right? And you're eventually typically going to lose. It's so much easier to break stuff. But in the Jeopardy styles, and we include all those types. And we also, there's more. There's purple too. So we do it all. And in fact, with this, our postmortems. So we've started doing recorded postmortems, and that's where the real learning. So if you didn't make it all the way through one of our challenges, wait a couple of weeks. We'll take you through the walkthrough, or at the events that we do, we'll give you the walkthrough, and we'll even allow you to replay some of those challenges, assuming that it's has a cloud component, or we can make it available. And so that feedback loop, being able to get the training, that's what it's really about. The edutainment piece is super important. Back in 2012, I had the opportunity to write another GSEC gold paper. I don't know anybody who's done this process. It's really, really a great process because it forces you to do some discipline, lets you earn your certification. And then the SANS reading room can get the message out. So at this point, I was like, look, there's a shortage of cyber operations personnel. Well, we know that, right? We haven't been able to fill that. There were a lot of cyber ranges coming out. There were a lot of games out there, but few of them were fit for purpose for training, assessing, or recruiting cyber operations personnel. And the problem was we were dividing the community. And so there was no way, you have to play my game. I can't play your game, because if those players are playing that game, you're cannibalizing my business model, right? Now, remember, shortage of humans, this pie is pretty big, but everybody wanted to be the only person there owning that, which was kind of a failed strategy, I think. And at the end of the day, the call to action was, we need a way to abstract these and to have some adopted community standard for sharing simulations. And that would also be required if we ever wanted to automate the creation. Because I figured if we could automate the creation of these things, then I could play again, right? So it's all about me. So the simulation definition language, I propose 9 primitives. And, we've been doing this using this methodology for almost 15 years, even before it was published. And it really is the way I look at things. And so I have the primitives. If you give me those 9 primitives, or actually with 3 primitives, we can run a game. But if you have all of them, you can have a very rich, immersive experience. And you can also abstract it. So from that, it's probably hard to see, but basically that little paragraph gives you all the elements that you need to run a game, and to do it in an ability to actually train, assess, and recruit, whatever your objective happens to be. And then they go through multiple transforms. So you can actually put this in, we've built these in YAML, so we can automate the creation of artifacts. And imagine not having to burn a game. So a lot of times when you play one of these games, it's burned. Because especially if you're doing the postmortems, you can never play that game again. But if you start doing this, you would be able to regenerate things. You could still have the same objectives, whatever those happen to be, whether a learning objective or assessment objective. And you could, in theory, automate this. And this is actually the future. So you'll have games that can spin up, and you'll be able to reuse the storyline, which makes it fun and immersive and human-friendly, but have actually different levels of complexity. So when I'm building games, where or when I'm coaching people on how to build games, because that was ultimately what we wanted to do. You can't have a sport if you don't have players and the leagues, and adopting this after the professional sports that everybody knows and loves. What are we doing to get those people involved and reach out to folks that normally wouldn't even care about this? How do you make it spectator friendly? Well, for our games, we like creativity. We like innovators. So anything that's not expressly prohibited is allowed. there's a lot of wiggle room in that. And I can tell you, we have to get very specific with our rules on scoring. Now, as in the Packetwars games, we're not a democracy. On the Packet Master, I'd have the final say, which is cool. But that's not how you're going to get the masses to come and play. So you have to, what we're doing with the coaches and the timeouts and all this, I really think that's the future for the cyber sport piece of this. But we've seen some really fun stuff. So, we now have to state, you don't break any laws, don't hurt people, even though typically those are the same thing. We call them out specifically. No layer 1 attacks. In the early days when we would set up, run those Cat 5s, people would cut cables. And now you're DOSed, layer 1. It's all about layer 1. And then, the other people, they start, running against that room with the pitchforks and, bear spray and all that stuff. So that's not a safe environment. And that's what you really want to do, have a safe and secure environment so that people can go out and learn without hurting themselves. And that cyber range, like a shooting range, hopefully there is a safety practice there. Mix it up. Basically, you need a balance of different skill sets. So when you're running competitions like this, where you've gone all year and they get the league charts, and you're going to know what your skill sets are. Your teams know who they are. You can have specialization. When we run games at a conference where we're just showing up and asking people just to show up and play, we have to build games or challenges that are accessible to noobs, but also challenging for elites. And so that in itself is a challenge, but we've gotten pretty good at it. Start with the objectives and constraints. So that's everything I do when I do any game, any challenge is what is our objective? And then what's our constraints? So sometimes the constraints are budgets. Many times at conferences, it's time frame or what the network's going to be like. We typically have 6 teams with 5 players, no substitutions. And that allows us to contain our universe of possibilities, right? So we know what our bandwidth requirements need to be, and we'll do the drops. So those scenarios that you saw before, the battle briefings, we do one of those for every game that we play, and we will typically give that out ahead of time, or we'll drop clues and hints before the games because we're trying to promote the game, we're trying to promote the event, and we're trying to promote recruiting of cyber talent. Music and eye candy. You got to have it. And remember, I was just another hacking game until I saw that geisha girl come on and start trash talking the companies. I was hooked. That was immersive to me. Sometimes it's the eye candy. We were talking to people earlier. You remember the Norse attack maps? Now, I'm not sure those are really honeypots or that was real data, but what got your attention. And so you get that attention, you hook them in, then you can start to say, hey, what are you doing here? Okay, this is cool. I want to do that. Points for flair, again, that's everything is dependent on what you're trying. Comic-Con, 2 weeks ago? There probably would have been a lot of potential flair points given there, huh? Have fun, that's super important. If it's not fun, and that's kind of the debrief that we do every year for our teams when we're playing the games. Did you have fun? Did you learn something? And if we can't keep saying that, then why do it? That does not help my bliss index, which is a new thing I've taken on. And then play. And so now there's lots of opportunities for people to play that weren't there before. So I think it's very good. I'm super jazzed to be here. And with that, I think Matt is going to tell you about his experience, and then maybe we can talk about our collaboration.
Yeah, we can riff a little bit.
Oh, I do in the future. Oh,
yes.
Well, the future is that Angus doesn't know all his slides. So for us, we're doing this, but we also, I almost didn't put this in there. I think everybody is starting to adopt some of these. So we're trying to build our scenarios out with that model I showed you to map against MITRE ATT&CK defend. That way we could start to maybe not have the scenario definition language, but if you play this game over here and do well against these TTPs, then we could maybe unified league chart where you can play these games, or you can play Packetwars, and then you could place to get into the other leagues, and or play some of your challenges and actually get continuing education credits, but then also get an invitation to one of the other games. Because right now, the scoring and talent, we don't have a way to unify that. Also, NICE's training framework. So if you're going career path, workforce development, mapping that in there. So that's really what's happening on the back end for us. Obviously, AIs, the grand champion, I think it was the Carnegie Mellon team that won the Cyber Challenge when Black Hat did that with the AIs. AI adversaries, or whether they're blue or red. We're doing some immersive VR challenges. So right now, that's going to look like we bring all of the captains into a briefing in a VR space. Full VR immersion challenges at some point, but we're still learning to walk on that. Multi-domain challenges, so the cyber physical bits that I mentioned before, but also sector-specific stuff. So you'll see a lot. I think there's a lot of OT challenges happening. And the cool thing about that is most security professionals won't ever really have access to smart meters or smart grids or SCADA systems. So that's why it's important to have those. And there's a lot of universities that have invested heavily in those spaces. And our game space can connect those. We actually have some pretty interesting ways to take 3 physical spaces and connect them into one single battle space. Of course, what we're doing here, this to me, what we're involved in is the future of Cyber Olympics. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I really think that. And then you're seeing celebrities, people that are just doing Twitch broadcasting. That is their whole job, talking about games. And we have the people doing the commentary on the games and that feedback. That's another way to make it spectator friendly. Show, diversity is good for the species, showing the people that look like them doing the things that they could do. Wow, I want to be that. That's super important. And I believe this is what we're getting. And that will be a job at some point. And then, Cold War, Packetwars, been very good to us. We love it. But we want to stop promoting the war or attack. We want to start doing hacking for good. So you'll probably see us rebranding some of our events for Hacking for Hope and doing charity work, which we did some of that over the last couple of years. I think that will be our focus as we move forward. So sorry about that misleading, but here's Matt.
Oh, no, that's great. That's great. Thanks, Brian. So my name's Matt Berry. I'm the Global Field CTO of Cyber at Worldwide Technology. Worldwide Technology, we've been in business a little over 30 years, and we do a little bit of everything. So our security business, it makes up probably about 15% of our overall business number, but we are very heavy in supply chain, IT, really any challenge that the enterprise faces. And I think that's a really important thing to call out as we talk about cyber range. And sort of what I think is the next step in the maturation of cyber range, which is really attacking and defending an enterprise at scale. Really, what that means. A little bit. So Angus said he's a security researcher, aka hacker. I started on the engineering side, so I was a lab monkey. And spent the better part of 10 years building complex lab environments. And it's sort of fitting because my entrance into technology was, I grew up in Southern California. My parents had an old MS-DOS computer, and I would go down there and play California games. Anyone remember California games? So I'd play California games, and then the game would crash, and then I would try to fix it, which would inevitably lead to DOS not working. And after enough times of my dad taking the computer to the repair tech, he finally said, I'm not paying for this anymore. If you want to play games, you have to fix it yourself. So I found out how to fix it myself. Then we upgraded to a Windows machine, and then more breaking and entering occurred, and that's how I got into tech. Yeah, so
classic.
Yeah, fueled by a love of games. So one of the things I think is really important as we think about building cyber ranges, which essentially what you're doing is you're building a lab environment, and you're applying a framework on top of it. You're creating a story, an immersive story. And that's really where Worldwide Technology connected with Brian. We had a mutual connection, and we brought Brian and his team in to help us with the development of that immersive storyline that connected to the tech, to the lab. And I think when we first built sort of our 1.0 version of the Cyber Range, we underestimated how important the storyline actually was to the game. It's one thing to create a very complex environment. It's another thing to take that environment and turn it into a game. Because if you don't have the immersive story, you basically have a lab. You have a lab with a lab guide, and you're walking through things, figuring step by step. And we wanted to do something different. But I think for many of us who are coming from the technology side of things, we can get really enamored with the cool widget, right? Like you can spend hundreds of hours building a lab, and it's super cool, and you have all this awesome automation. But from my perspective now on the enterprise side, working with the Fortune 50, the big question at the end of the day is, how does this relate to the business challenges that an enterprise actually faces, right? So it's one thing to talk about risk reduction, but at the end of the day, corporations, they only care about risk because risk impacts the bottom line, right? So they care about, how are we going to make more revenue? How are we going to protect our brand reputation, which, is again, protecting loss of revenue? How are we going to mitigate risk? Because risk has a direct correlation to regulatory and fines, especially on the financial services side. So one of the things that we always try to keep really front and center when we build labs in our cyber range is, what is the business outcome that we're actually trying to drive towards? And Brian talked earlier a lot about how ranges can be used for recruiting and finding talent. And I think it's really important, personally, I think it's really important that as we're looking for talent and we're hiring people into organizations, to start them very early on having that business mindset and trying to understand the technology through the lens of the organization that they're defending, right? Security touches everything. So 10 years ago, when I began building labs at Worldwide Technology, they were pretty simple. And I mean, you'd probably agree with this. Like 10 years ago, you throw a firewall out there, you throw a couple Linux boxes, pew, shooting gallery, it's easy, right? And I think part of the challenge that organizations have today is we're no longer talking about security in terms of perimeter security. Organizations are at different stages of a cloud migration. So they have their sensitive data on-prem. They also have it in the cloud. They also use SaaS applications that use cloud-based resources, that are abstracted from you. So data is literally strewn throughout the world. And when it comes to creating labs, we had one customer come to us. Some of the labs that we create are story-based labs, but we find that more often than not, the story-based labs hop into real-world questions that our customers ask. So we had one customer, I'm going to abstract this a bit just for the protection of the customers that we work with, sort of an amalgamation of multiple customers here. But we had one customer who came to us and they said, we're interested in moving away from one particular vendor on the endpoint security, the EDR side, to another. And we have 3 different vendors that we're looking at. And every one of them tells us that their product is the best product for us. So at some point, we need some validation that the products are actually going to work the way that they should work. So we said, hey, no problem. Okay, so we created a lab environment, and I'm going to touch on a few lessons learned here in just a moment. But we created this lab environment. We ran through a series of tests. We provided back an efficacy score to this customer, a score, for vendor A, B, and C. And lo and behold, all of them scored. The delta between them was about 2 or 3% difference, right? So, and that was pretty typical. But then this customer came back to us and they said, it was a really astute response. They said, okay, that's good. It validates what we have seen internally. But the problem that we have is most of our users are on a VDI environment. And that VDI environment, we already know it's horrifically oversubscribed because this was during the days of COVID, right? So everyone who was normally in a branch using a corporate asset or in a headquarters building, you know, they didn't need to use VDI, but now they have everyone's working from home. They said we're gonna roll out this solution. And we know that we don't have enough IOPS on our disk arrays. We know we don't have enough memory. We don't have enough CPU. So we're really concerned when it comes to deploying this tool that is intended to detect anything going on and send that telemetry to a centralized point for processing. We know there's going to be challenges. So we created a series of tests. We stood up a VDI infrastructure, integrated it into the environment, pulled a ton of data for them with performance testing, but then they brought in their red teams and blue teams and conducted live fire exercises inside of this environment with a resource constrained VDI infrastructure. And lo and behold, you begin to realize that if the agent that's on a device has limited memory and CPU and disk IO, the telemetry doesn't get to the cloud as fast as you would want, right? Which again, from a business perspective, it really introduces it's an interesting vulnerability, right? So if you are attacking an environment with a VDI infrastructure and you overload a system with, let's say you're not even doing anything malicious as an attacker, but you're just consuming that disk IO and that memory churn, all of a sudden you find that window of time between when an event occurs and when it shows up in a console from a vendor goes from maybe 30 seconds to now 7 minutes.
And speaking of temporal, if you looked at doing 3 pilots or QA testing, a red team, blue team exercise, QA, you get all of that in this one simulation. And all your stakeholders benefit. So you get to value quicker for less money or less investment.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think it's an important side of sort of the cyber range concept. It's great to do red team versus blue team, but introducing those types of real world situations, I think is what is going to prepare the next generation of analysts and incident responders to be able to really respond to very weird circumstances, right? I just want to point out one list of things, sort of some lessons that I learned along the way. So first of all, when we build ranges and labs for customers, they always say, can you replicate my environment at scale? And I always ask them, what does that mean to you? They say, well, I have 600,000 devices in my environment. Can you make a lab with 600,000 devices? And I say, absolutely, I could. It's going to cost you a fortune. And there's going to be 600,000 Windows 10 boxes out there sitting doing absolutely nothing. And if I write you a script to mimic user behavior, it's going to be the exact same script running in a loop on 600,000 devices. So when you're creating these complex environments, the number of devices is less important. What is important is the complexity of the environment, right? So you could get away having 10 Windows machines, having some different variations of the operating system, having different variations of the Linux system, but adding in VDI, adding in storage arrays, adding in phone systems, right? So part of my roots also is installing contact centers and voice over IP. Adding that kind of complexity really makes the environment more real world. And then lastly, I know that sort of the tradition of cyber range relies very heavily on open source tools. And I think that's fantastic. I was talking with somebody yesterday, and he was talking about how, the importance of, if you use open source tooling, you're really teaching people the fundamentals. So they're not learning how a particular vendor functions. They're really forced to learn, how IP traffic works and sort of the vulnerabilities and the nuances around it. But on the flip side of that, I would argue that if we're truly training people to operate as defenders in an organization, it's really helpful for them to be able to have access beyond just open source tools, right? So you have a high school student or a college student who goes through a training program like this or a championship, and if they get recruited into an organization, how great for them to be able to walk in and say, I've done testing and I've actively defended with this vendor and this vendor, and I know how this SASE vendor interacts with this EDR tool and this DSPM that identifies the data. So there's a lot of really great scenarios that we've been able to build and run, leveraging our OEM relationships to sort of make that step beyond open source.
Absolutely.
So I think with that, I'll probably just pause here. I don't know if we have any questions from the audience.
We have a question over here. You have Mike.
Hey, great briefs, guys. Thanks. To your comment, Matt, right?
Mm-hmm.
Matt, with regards to scoping down your range, how does that scale to reality in a range, in a training scenario? Say you're training SOC operators and you want them to be able to understand the complexity of 600 Windows workstations with different problems. So is there a baseline where you go, okay, this kind of replicates that range or and that scope?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the easy answer to it is sort of the old adage, how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. So we spend a lot of time asking our customers, they'll have a very complex question and we'll ask them why. Why do you need this level of complexity? They answer, they give it. The whole, if you heard the 5 whys, you ask it again and again and again to really get to the heart of what they're looking to do. So what we usually do is we follow a modularized approach. So we'll try to narrow in very, very specifically into what are your pain points today. And that usually will come down to, well, we have this project going on, or we had a recent event that occurred and it involved these 3 components. Say, okay, let's start there. We run through the testing, we give them access, they go through the learning process, and then we just iterate on that and add in more. So it's almost like a journey where you're building an environment for the customer, you're building out that complexity sort of along the way, an agile approach rather than a waterfall approach.
But for certain sectors, you can actually merge battle spaces. So I know University of Illinois has a smart grid that actually emulates. I think they have 10,000 nodes or meters that are actually there. So you could simulate the enterprise, the back office, or the billing front office, whichever that happens to be in your sector, and merge that battle space by joining up other ranges. And so I think that's the future of totally immersive, real world simulation. But to your point about the complexity, the complexity is where you're going to highlight the hidden dependencies. And the hidden dependencies that lead to cascading failure, those are the things we need to catch. If anybody remember Mariah botnet, there was a lot of collateral damage in that. In fact, my systems were taken out. I wasn't a target, but because I used Dyn DNS for one of my services, they got knocked over. And the interesting thing about that, look who was excluded from those attacks. It's .gov and GE. So I'm not sure who wrote that thing, but having those two, it's kind of strange. So they didn't want to really take everything out, but they did cause collateral damage besides not being able to tweet or watch Netflix.
Nice. Anyone else?
Things here. One, can you share the white paper link again? I would love to paw through that, and it's given me some really great ideas. 2, can you talk a little bit more about like the metrics and the reporting that you're getting out of the exercises, right? So is it a better strategy to like kind of hot wash as you go along, or save it all up as you do like a post-event debrief? And then how do the people ingest that, and what are they doing with that data as they get it?
Yeah, well, for us, we have this concept of total telemetry. So we want to capture everything from every perspective. That's not always possible, especially we mentioned some people who might not want their tools and techniques to be well understood, so that's not available to us. But we start out with that as a capability. So where you're monitoring that telemetry is important. And it does, if you're going to do scoreboards, if your purpose for the telemetry is to have this interactive, that can also be an indicator. So it can provide benefit to the players that you might not want to have. So sometimes you'll see delays put in there purposefully, and sometimes you won't have that. For us, again, it's what's the objective. So if we're actually running the game to QA or test a certain technology, we do that overtly or covertly, meaning you won't even know that we're testing that. Because that's who's funding this project. You're having fun, they're sponsoring it. Or we'll do product placement where you're actually getting, the play-by-play and the tool, but you're really getting a product demonstration because the logo's down there and you're just subliminally getting it. So it really is what we're trying to do. As far as, especially in mixed skill levels, we have some injects or drops all ready to go. So if they're not progressing where we think they should be at a certain point, Packetmaster gets on and gives them some hints. We run our own kind of Discord, Slack. We don't, it's a private capability. We spin those up. So there's a public forum where people can ask questions. Part of the strategy is if you ask us a question and we give you an answer, that answer and question is available to everybody. So there's a strategy right there if you want to. There's so many ways that can go, right? But we want to do a complete. So what we try to do is have our postmortem use the most logical attack path and have that prepared. But many times other people, and this is the innovation, they're going to come at it from a completely different way. So we will acknowledge that. And we may even be asking them, why the heck did you do that? This is the way you should have gone. It's like, well, no, why would I have done that? In fact, we had a guy who is a influencer and he all he does is it was a game in Germany. There wasn't enough seats. So he basically did the entire challenge on his cell phone. And he found out aspects of it that it took the other teams two battles before they got to. So you have a plan, but you have to be flexible.
It's a great, I don't know if there's a whole lot that I can add on to that, except to say, I think when you look at ranges and scenarios, I think that if I had to put them in buckets, you have the types of scenarios that are highly repeatable, it's almost like a training curriculum where you're taking somebody from zero to hero, you're baselining them and you're comparing them to other folks, either in your organization or outside your organization. I think for those types of lab environments, it's very easy to create many different types of metrics that are automatically collected and reported back as sort of a scorecard because you're running through this scenario literally thousands of times, again and again and again. When you get into more customized lab environments that I know you build and that we offer, I think it really highlights the need for having those real-time proctors who are watching and scoring and looking at the techniques and doing those postmortems at the end. I think that's where the most value is, where I personally have seen the most value in those debriefs of being able to say, from our observations, it took you this long, you used this technique. And I loved your comment about how, you build a game and you put a lock on a door and you think that everybody's going to go through that door. And then you get
smashing the windows.
somebody who breaks a window over here and goes around. And then you're like, oh no, half of the game is compromised. So it's interesting for sure. Cool. Maybe one last question. All right.
Okay. Well, thank
Thanks
you
a
guys. That
lot.
was great. One just piece of advice from my side. As an industry that tends to point at people and say, you're the problem, whenever you're doing a postmortem, one thing to try to think about, don't blame a person. In work, cyber range, tabletops, it's not you think about the factors that led the person to make the mistake. And you write postmortems like that, you're going to find a lot better collaboration with the rest of your business because you're not pointing at people and saying, you're the problem. Thank you guys.
Totally
Appreciate it.
Yeah,
And that ends our day.